And remember some of the things we went over. So we're going to start with our objectives here. We're just going to look at the opposing sides of the Cold War, some of our basic terminology, and then we're going to go all the way up to Vietnam. We're going to do a special Vietnam unit, so I'm not going to include that here. So the first things we have to look at are the Yalta and Potsdam conferences. Okay, these are the meetings between the big three, and our big three are the US, the UK, and USSR. Remember the U's. The decisions for post-war Europe are made at the Yalta and the Potsdam conferences. Okay, and the first one is at Yalta, it's a strategies for the end of the war. How are they going to defeat the Nazis? How are they going to go on to defeat Japan? They've decided to focus on the Nazis first, turn all their attention on Japan. Soviet Union will enter the war, but the United States obviously beats them to the punch and drops the atomic bomb. They agree to the division of Germany. Germany is going to be divided into its 4 occupation zones. Germany is too dangerous, they think, to be left as one country, so instead it's going to be divided so it can be governed and denazified. But there's major disagreements over Eastern Europe. Stalin controlled Eastern Europe entirely at the end of the war. Soviet troops were garrisoned in countries like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Poland, and they controlled it, and he begins installing communist puppet governments. And the West is going to disagree with this. And then finally, this is considered the end of the Grand Alliance. The Grand Alliance refers to the alliance between the Western democracies and the Soviet Union. But the disagreements over Eastern Europe are going to be the big breaking point between those different sides. So here's the Yalta Conference. You can see in the middle is FDR. Then on his immediate right is Winston Churchill. And then on his left is Stalin. At the Potsdam Conference, we trade out FDR for Truman, but you still have Stalin and Churchill will be on his way out pretty soon. So Germany is divided after the war, and we can see that East Germany is going to be under control of the Soviets, and West Germany is going to be split between the French, the British, and the Americans. But the interesting thing is Berlin. Berlin, that we went over before the closure, Berlin was also split between the different sides in the war. But Berlin is deep inside the Soviet zone, and this is going to cause issues because this is a democratic island inside a communist dictatorship, which the Soviet Union is very much going to disagree with. We can see the division of Europe here. Anybody who is in kind of that greenish color is going to be with the Soviet Union, and anybody who is in the like goldish yellow color is going to be a non-communist nation. Now notice I didn't say aligned with the United States. Some of these nations will stay neutral, but they disagree with the Soviet Union having direct control over those countries in green. So the Iron Curtain is what we refer to as the division of Europe. So if we look at the picture in the bottom, red is always going to represent the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. Blue is going to be NATO and the United States and the democracies. The black line that runs down the spine of Europe is what's called the Iron Curtain. It's a separation between the democratic and the communist nations. It is not a literal wall. It's not a fence. It is a symbol of one side is free democracies, the other side is authoritarian communist nations. If you look down in the bottom corner at Yugoslavia, you can see that it is a communist nation, it's socialist, but it is led by a different brand of socialism under Tito, who absolutely hates Stalin. So they're not going to get along, and they're not going to be part of the nations that are considered behind the Iron Curtain. So whenever I say behind the Iron Curtain, that's going to refer to the nations in Europe only that are communist controlled by the Soviet Union. So America is going to take a huge interest in stopping the spread of communism. The first way we're going to do that is through the Truman Doctrine. So this is going to be military aid to any nation that decides to resist communism. This does not mean we're going to directly confront the Soviet Union. Instead, we're going to support nations that are trying to fight back against communist control. The first nations we send it to are Greece and Turkey. If you look at a map in Europe, Greece and Turkey are actually very close to a lot of Soviet-controlled countries. It makes sense that they then have a communist rebellion supported by the Soviet Union. The United States then sends guns, money, medical supplies, advisors to their governments to try and get them to not flip to communism and keep them with the capitalist democracies. This is under the policy of containment that the United States begins to follow in the mid 40s and 50s, all the way through the 90s to the fall of the Soviet Union. The goal is to just keep communism contained to its existing borders. It's basically a quarantine. The United States views communism as a virus. They need to stop it from spreading. They're not going to actually try and invade Eastern European countries and switch them back to being capitalist democracies. They're going to simply try and stop them from exporting communism to other nations. We do this through the Marshall Plan, where the U.S. creates a financial aid plan to rebuild Europe. If you remember about what we talked about, the goal is first to rebuild European nations. The war in Europe had destroyed cities, it destroyed bridges, roads, railroads, factories, and people were beginning to turn to communism because it was offering a solution to poverty. So the United States says we will rebuild Europe. That way, those people have jobs, they have homes, they have cars, and they won't actually want to turn to communism that way. And then later on, the United States develops the theory called the domino theory. And this is the idea that one nation after another would fall to communism. This is going to be applied in Vietnam and Asia, especially, where it seems like just because Korea fell to communism, next would be Vietnam, and then it would be Thailand, and then would be the Philippines, and then finally Japan. The United States wants to avoid that. So the alliances that start up during the Cold War were always going to represent one with red and one with blue. On the blue, we're going to have the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. This is the United States and its allies, and the goal is to counter Soviet expansion. It's based on the idea of collective security, where if one nation in NATO is attacked, it equals an attack on all of them, and they're all going to fight as a group to try and hold back the Soviets from expanding. The Soviets counter with the Warsaw Pact of security, and they're going to try and control their satellite nations. They're going to make sure that communist nations stay in line. They know the Soviet Union is in charge, and if they get out of line, the Soviet Union will beat them back. So our early conflicts is first over Berlin. If you look at the picture in the corner right here, you'll see this little spot here that has all the different colors, and that is Berlin. And Berlin's split between the different nations who won the war. So Berlin is deep in the Soviet zone, but it has pieces of the American, British, and French zones in it. So what the Soviets do is they blockade it. They try and cut off all supplies coming into Berlin. They effectively want to starve the Allies out of East Germany. But the Allies start a massive airlift, mostly led by the United States and UK, where they bring in all the supplies needed for Berlin on airplanes, because if Stalin shoots down an airplane, it could start a war, and at this point, the United States is the only one that has nuclear weapons. The airlift works, and it forces the USSR to lift the blockade. This is a small victory for containment, because even though the Berlin right here is just a very small piece of a democracy, they stopped communism from spreading to it. It embarrasses the Soviet Union, and it makes the Western democracies look stronger. Our next conflict isn't an actual war, but it's the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. This is going to be exclusively between those two countries. So the goal is to build better and more nuclear weapons than each other. They want to continue making more, because if I have more nuclear weapons than you, I could hit your country and your country could not hit me back. But it leads to the idea of MAD, mutually assured destruction, where if one country launches its nuclear weapons, the other country will launch all its, and both nations will end up destroyed. Finally, we have the conflicts in China. So the Chinese Civil War begins, and it starts all the way before World War II, and it goes all the way to 49, and it is between the nationalists, who are supported by the United States, and the communists, who are obviously supported by the Soviet Union. America ends up not supporting the nationalists. We don't actually send troops, we just send them supplies. But what happens is the communists end up winning the Civil War. This is a major loss for containment, because the world's largest populated nation has now switched to communism. They're going to be a major Soviet ally for a while, and it's going to kind of make it so that idea of the domino theory seems even more true. Next we have the Korean War. So after World War II, Korea was divided between the Soviet Union and the United States at the 38th parallel, right where my mouse is. North would become a communist nation, South would become a capitalist democracy. But in 1950, under the Kim family, Communist North invades the South, and this is kind of allowed by the Soviet Union. So their goal is going to be to invade the South, reconquer all of Korea, reunite it under a communist nation. But the UN tasked the US and several other nations, France, Australia, Great Britain, with pushing the communists back and restoring South Korea as a capitalist nation. So after years, if you look at the map of back and forth, the war actually stalemates right where it began at the 38th parallel, and they form the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone. The DMZ, actually, funny enough, is the most heavily armed area on the planet, and it separates North and South Korea to this day. This is an example of a containment. Notice that the UN forces didn't actually flip North Korea to being a capitalist nation. They nearly contained North Korea. So the Cuban Missile Crisis is going to be a key moment in the Cold War because this is the closest the world has ever gotten to actually having a nuclear war. Fidel Castro overthrows Cuba, which was a U.S. ally and is only 90 miles from Florida. And it becomes a communist nation, which obviously, if you look at the picture in the right-hand corner, aligns itself with the Soviet Union. The U.S. then uses a counter-invasion at the Bay of Pigs, training Cuban exiles who had fled Castro to try and overthrow him. But it fails, and Castro turns to the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union decides to give Castro the ultimate check against the United States. They tell Castro they will put their nuclear weapons in Cuba. This is a major threat to the United States. It's only 90 miles away. Missiles can hit every major city in the United States. They can hit the Panama Canal. This threatens the United States. It's kind of like the ultimate checkmate. But the U.S. quarantines Cuba. Now, the reason it's called a quarantine is because that doesn't mean the United States declared war on Cuba. We merely put our Navy around Cuba and we tell the Soviets no missiles can get to Cuba. If they do, we'll open fire. This ends up working, and the Soviet Union has to remove their missiles from Cuba, but not before the United States makes some deals to remove ours from Turkey. So both nations slowly begin turning the tensions down on the Cold War because it scared them so much that they got so close to a nuclear war. And finally, getting back to Berlin. So Berlin became another source of conflict because, like we said, Berlin was in the East Germany. It was in the communist zone. But what people were doing is they would flee from East Berlin to West Berlin. They would ask to become a citizen of West Berlin, where it was a democracy, where there was capitalism, it was doing better. And this makes the Soviet Union and communism look bad, so they want to stop this. So what they do is they build the Berlin Wall. This is literally a wall that goes all the way around the city of West Berlin and cuts it off from East Berlin. It's meant to keep the citizens of West Berlin in and keep the citizens of East Berlin from fleeing. But it becomes a symbol of the separation between the East and the West. It shows that the Soviet Union is closing itself off from the West. It's trying to keep the ideas of the West out, and it's going to stand all the way into the 90s until Germany will eventually be reunited. So that's our quick review on the Cold War. I hope it helped. If you have any other questions, let me know, and this video will be posted for you to take a look